Next up, we've got This Week in Law with Gary Reback, Todd Wichmann, and Evan Brown, who's creepily younger than I am, we discover. We're going to also discover a lot about antitrust and specifically the issues touching the tech companies, Apple and Google in particular. We'll also let you know how you can avoid having Amazon and Apple fix the prices on your books next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise Howell, episode 160, recorded May 4, 2012. Price fixing, worse than murder. This episode of This Week in Law is brought to you by ShareFile. Enhance your workflow. Send files of almost any size easily and securely with ShareFile, brought to you by Citrix. Try ShareFile today. I have a great offer to get you started, a 30-day free trial plus get double storage. To get this great offer, visit sharefile.com, click the radio microphone, and enter my promo code TWiL. And by Squarespace. Squarespace is the fast and easy way to create a high-quality website or blog. For a free trial and 10% off your first purchase on new accounts, go to squarespace.com and use offer code TWiL5. And they now offer free domain name registration with annual plan subscriptions.
Hello, and welcome to This Week in Law. I'm Denise Howell, and you have joined us for Reback and Alia 2, Return of the Gary. We have Gary Reback with us. Joining us after an almost 3-year absence from This Week in Law. We're really happy to have you back, Gary.
Great to be here, Denise.
We have lots to talk about. There has been much antitrust stuff going on in the tech world, so I thought it was about time that we go deep on a couple of those issues to help our listeners and viewers understand better what's going on. I know we've been kind of limping along with the media coverage of the Apple and most of Google antitrust investigations, so we're really thrilled to have Gary here who knows all about this stuff. He was a pivotal part of the Microsoft antitrust proceedings. And basically, antitrust, is it safe to say, Gary, it's your passion and your life?
Well, it's my life. Whether it's my passion or not is a different question, Denise.
All right. Well, at least we'll be able to pick your brain on some issues that might be above our heads. Also joining us is Todd Wichmann. Todd is an entrepreneur and an engineer and a member of the TWiT Army who contacted me after episode 349 of TWiT when they were discussing the Apple antitrust and price fixing case. And reminded me about the Robinson-Patman Act, which is a part of the antitrust law in the United States that I did some legal work on years and years and years ago and have probably forgotten more than I ever knew about it. So we're going to talk about that today and otherwise just get Todd's take and insights into the antitrust issues as well. Hello, Todd.
Hello. Thanks for having me on the show. It's as a member of the TWiT Army, I am very happy to be on the my first TWiT podcast. So this is a special treat for me. Thanks for having me.
It's a treat to have you. We're glad that you prompted us to do this particular slant on antitrust law today on the show. And also joining us here on May the 4th, May the 4th be with you, everyone, is Evan Brown. Hello, Evan.
Yes, and May the 4th to you too, Denise. Great to be here. Thanks for having me back. Looking forward to the conversation and learning a little bit about this thing they call antitrust.
Yeah, me too. I guess we're here on the one day of the year when May the 4th, or when a rebel yell means more about Chewbacca than it does about Billy Idol. So glad to be able to bring us all together on such a momentous day. I also have a warning, and I hope you don't mind my doing this, Evan, for all of you out there who may, encounter and meet smart people online, on the internet, and decide maybe to do a show with them. if they're really, really smart, they're liable to be younger than you, say about 10 years younger, like Evan in my case, which I never give a thought to, really, because Evan is so smart and erudite and polished. And frankly, I mostly feel 10 years his junior than the opposite way. But this morning we figured out something that actually makes it kind of disturbing. That's my warning, that if you find people this way and wind up working with them on a regular basis, that it can get creepy in ways that you did not expect. Evan has a 15-year college reunion coming up, and I shot back to him that, oh yeah, I just had my 15th wedding anniversary. And we quickly were able to back that up and figure out that when I met my husband, Evan was 12.
Right. So, and you know, my role in this is, you know, I'll just back you up and make you feel whatever age feels right. I'll claim everything except the making you feel creepy part, and we'll just go with that. How does it sound?
That's right. I'm just going to refer to you as Evan Palau from now on.
Great, thanks. I'll wear that badge with honor. Thanks.
Yes. Okay, well, from the ridiculous to the sublime, let's head on into some antitrust discussion. Now, folks are probably well aware, and if you're not, we'll make you aware that Apple is among the companies under investigation from the Department of Justice right now. And you've probably read the stories about closed-door meetings in fancy restaurants with members of the publishing industry deciding about the price of ebooks in Apple's ebook store, the iBook store. And interestingly, what they all decided was to make a price for the ebooks that was significantly higher than what was being charged by who was then the incumbent, with a huge customer base and lots of loyal fans of the Kindle, Amazon, who charges $9.99 for ebooks. Apple and certain publishers decided that in the iBook store, that price would be $14.99. The Department of Justice is not pleased about the way this came about, or the alleged way this came about. There is an investigation going on about it, and has decided to move forward along those lines. We were discussing on the TWiT show on this network a few episodes back, on episode 349, this case, and Leo was having a hard time getting his head around how this could actually be anti-competitive behavior. So why don't we start with a little background on antitrust law, what it's there for, what it consists of, and how it plays out in our daily lives. First of all, Todd, you had an interesting insight into why we actually call these antitrust laws. Can you tell us what you know about that?
Sure. My first company, when I left my former employer, I was an employee at Procter & Gamble. You're going to realize that most of my expertise and examples are going to be from boring categories such as detergents and cleaning products. I'm not a blogger, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not a tech aficionado. I'm more of a tech enthusiast. So my examples are going to be very more old school, so to speak. So I left Procter & Gamble and acquired some of their detergent brands, namely the Oxidol and Biz bleach brands. And at the time, the only people that were really interested in funding detergent companies in the year 2000 were old school, more traditional investors such as the Rockefeller family. That was the height of the dot-com boom era. So I actually funded my first company with members of the Rockefeller family, and I was on the 55th floor at Rockefeller Center. And as a curious individual and one that kind of asked questions, maybe even in inappropriate times, I started asking about the history of the Standard Oil Company and really why these things were called antitrust. And it actually was impactful into my business model, because the way they invested in my company was what they've been doing for 100 years. And the reason why the law was called antitrust, was that, of course, they were using trust, a legal entity that is set up to essentially pass wealth from one generation to another is the primary use that the Rockefellers were using. And they were establishing trusts all over the country to try to maintain a monopoly in the oil markets without claiming to be the same ownership. In other words, it was legal entities. These trusts are all connected, even though they look like they were individual unique companies. But I've always wondered, why did they form trusts? Because why not just form shadow C corporations or LLCs or whatever was existence in the late 1800s to do this? Why did they actually create trusts instead of other legal entities? And the reason was simply that they were trying to pass wealth from one generation to another. So without going into a lot of details, I'd probably be boring. Rockefeller Sr. would put in maybe 10% of the investment, and 90% of the investment would come in as a debt instrument owned by the trust. That would be the junior Rockefeller's money. So the actual voting stock would be held in a very small financial instrument to control the company, but the vast majority of the wealth would be submitted as a debt instrument in the trust. So really, the reason why these trusts were set up was a way to pass wealth from one Rockefeller generation to the next, and that's why they weren't set up as LLCs or C Corps or whatever they wanted to be. I just thought that was interesting that no one ever really asked the question, well, why were trusts established instead of companies, and why these laws are called antitrust when they really have nothing to do with trusts themselves? So I got that straight from the Rockefeller Center themselves when they explained it to me.
That's pretty cool. Gary, so we've got the Sherman Antitrust Act that people have probably heard of, the Robinson-Patman Act, which people probably haven't heard that much about. We have the states coming into this with their various laws. So can you add anything further to just sort of our background discussion of antitrust framework?
Sure. Notwithstanding what the Rockefeller family might say, the background of antitrust is a little bit different. An in-house lawyer at Standard Oil was trying to figure out a way to keep Rockefeller's competitors from cutting price, and hit upon this notion of essentially setting up a big cartel in the industry and a trust instrument. You know, everybody uses trusts. For those of you who have children, you may have a trust to pay for their college education, and you may be the trustee of that. But in any event, they set up a trustee as a cartel. Eventually, the state governments banned these trusts, and so Rockefeller simply went out and bought up his competitors, or in some cases cajoled them to join his cartel or whatever. And they went into a system along the lines of what Todd was suggesting, basically. But anyway, eventually, in response to the cartelization of darn near every industry in the United States, states started passing laws, first outlawing the trust structure, and then trying to deal with the problems of monopolization and collusion directly. And so in 1898, Congress passed the Sherman Act, named for a United States senator, and it has two key provisions. One is to combat monopolization, monopoly maintenance, those kinds of things. The second is to combat collusion by competitors. The underlying theory is the same in both cases. It's a statutory commitment to competition. What makes our country great in that view is that we, in effect, force our capitalist companies to compete with each other. That's how consumers are benefited by lower prices. That's how entrepreneurs can enter the market with new ideas and new inventions. So that's the underlying idea. It was a distinctly American idea. We were the first country to have this kind of viewpoint about a statutory commitment to competition. It was since picked up by the European Union and all other developed economies in the world. And more recently, even the People's Republic of China, a communist country on its way to market liberalization, has adopted antitrust laws as a way to govern the growth of its economy. So that's kind of the background. Now, states have state law equivalents of the Sherman Act. There's also a federal act called the Clayton Act that, for the most part, deals with mergers and acquisitions. And there's a part of that act called the Robinson-Patman Act, which, frankly, is not very much in vogue. It's not enforced, frankly, at all at the federal level. Most economists think that it is anti-competitive as opposed to pro-competitive. But in any event, the Robinson-Patman Act prohibits price discrimination under certain circumstances, selling to one customer at one price and a different customer at a different price, but not in all circumstances. If you buy more, you can get a better price, and so forth and so on. And the caveat, generally speaking, in the Robinson-Patman Act, which is in the statute, is it's not unlawful to price discriminate unless there's a negative effect on competition. So for the most part, in recent decades, since at least the early 1980s, there's really been no national enforcement of the Robinson-Patman Act. So you're really talking about the Sherman Act. That's what's going on in these cases involving Google and Apple and other high-tech companies.
Looks like we dropped Denise.
Uh-oh.
Ruh-roh. 16 minutes in. Gotta know that for the notes.
I think she's actually just at the library reading the Robinson-Patman Act.
Ruh-roh.
Well, I can tell you...
Here I come. Back with you.
There we go.
There we go. Great. So I'm sorry I missed a bit of the end of that, Gary. But let me just forge ahead. We've got anti-competition laws in various states, unfair competition laws. Evan, maybe you could talk for a second about the interplay between those and antitrust, and do they have anything to do with antitrust, since they sound like they might be concerned with the same thing?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, Denise. We have a body of law. First, we have a body of law called Consumer Protection Law that is enforced both by our states and by the Federal Trade Commission. And this involves things like misrepresentations by companies. This is how the FTC has gotten involved with Google's privacy policy and with Facebook's privacy policy. It has to do with the consumer protection laws. Now, in some states, as you point out, there are also unfair competition laws, and the Federal Trade Commission, but not the Department of Justice, has the equivalent of that. I would think of them basically as more limited antitrust laws. I mean, for the purpose of a discussion here, for this kind of discussion with business people and lay people, we should really focus on the Sherman Act and monopolization and collusion. That's the easiest way to think about this.
Okay. Well, sorry, go ahead, Evan.
No, it was Todd.
No, this was actually Todd. I was just going to respond to what Gary was saying in terms of the Robinson-Patman Act. I think Apple could actually use some of those provisions as part of their defense. Far be it from me, I'm not going to try to act like Apple's attorney here. But from a consumer product standpoint, which is the world I come from, the Robinson-Patman Act is always referred to constantly. I mean, it's this thing that Procter & Gamble and all detergent companies or any kind of consumer product company is very, very concerned with. I guess there might not have been any active litigation in that area for a while, but it's something that everybody's very, very concerned about, at least from a legal standpoint, because the law is on the books. And I think from my layperson perspective, looking at the situation, it almost looks like the Department of Justice is coming from a world of laws and regulations and statutes based on physical goods that were historically sold under different pricing tiers based on how much you bought. And, for example, you can't say, well, my minimum quantities for this box of widgets is going to be a full truckload. That's the smallest quantity that you can order it in, because that might be deemed that you're only favoring the larger retailers. And when you get into a world of digital goods like ebooks, I'm just wondering if some of these laws, since they're written 100 years ago, are going to we're on brand new territory is what I'm getting at. In other words, if you're selling digital goods that don't have any cost of transmission, so it's not like when I'm selling detergent, there's tremendous savings in freight and other advantages by selling a full truckload. When you start shipping digital books, there essentially can only be one price, period, based on what the Robinson-Patman Act says. There is no discounting that makes sense based on quantities you purchase, which I think is one of the unique wrinkles in this whole debate. So, one argument could be that Apple isn't necessarily colluding on pricing based on what the publishers were giving. other than saying, based on the Robinson-Patman Act, that price has to be the same that you sell to anybody. Now, there's other issues talking about the agency fee that we'll get into probably that I think is where they get into trouble. But I'm just wondering if they could actually use the Robinson-Patman Act as their defense, saying, look, they got to sell it at the same price because it's the same good to the same channel of trade.
What do you think about that, Gary?
The short answer is no. The Robinson-Patman Act is not a defense to a charge of collusion or price fixing. We really pay defenses to collusion short shrift. And we've always done that for a very long time, for more than 100 years. And the reason is that if we honored the notion in the publishing industry, as they're suggesting, that we publishers need higher prices in order to survive, well, the next people we'd hear from would be the oil companies. And they'd say, oh, we need higher prices so that we have more money for drilling for new oil. And then we'd hear from the pharmaceutical companies, and they'd say, oh, we've got to get together and collude and have higher prices so we can do better R&D. And so we just decided more than 100 years ago, as a country, we're not going to listen to those kind of defenses. You don't collude over prices. I think we're off on a tangent, frankly, talking about the Robinson-Patman Act here. It's not a part of the government's case. I don't think it'll be a part of the defense. It's a minor footnote in antitrust history, and I think it's getting us a little off from what's actually going on in the major cases in the technology industry.
Well, with all due respect, Gary, I'm not, just to clarify what I'm saying, I'm not arguing about collusion. That's a whole separate discussion that we're going to probably get into today. My only question is, pull it outside the frame of this issue with Apple specifically in the ebooks. When you're selling digital goods, doesn't that by definition mean that if I'm going to sell you a digital copy of something, that the Robinson-Patman Act would basically require that I have to sell that individual digital file at the same price to any customer in the same channel of trade? If I was creating a new ebook service and I found out that St. Martin's Press was selling an ebook at a substantial discount to somebody else and they were charging me, wouldn't I be able to go after them saying that they weren't giving me the same pricing and the price discounts that they were offering other customers? I know that you're saying that this is kind of a tangent, and I agree it's not in the Department of Justice's case, but I just think it's an interesting wrinkle of the kind of world we live in right now. The law is basically saying you have to treat people equally in terms of pricing. Todd,
I can make this easy for you. The Robinson-Patman Act, by its terms, applies to the sale of products. Most digital products are licensed. And so for the most part, there's no applicability of the Robinson-Patman Act in digital distribution anyway. Now, there is some law around that's 20 years old, but basically the bottom line is in the distribution of digital goods, or in any kind of licensing scenario where there is a master copy and copies are made from that, you don't have the same kind of considerations of price discrimination because the statute, by its express terms, simply does not apply.
So
okay, let me ask something, Gary, if I could. I'm having a hard time getting my arms around why Apple and these publishers' move would be worthy of investigation at all, because what they've done is fixed a price that was higher than what the market was used to, and that strikes me as just shooting themselves in the foot as far as competition goes. If they were to get together and say, okay, so we're going to brave it out, and although we're going to take a loss on it, we're going to undercut Amazon and try and steal their customers that way and collude in order to do it, I could see why that would be, at least in my mind, more questionable. If they're going to be silly enough to set a higher price than what the market's already bearing, why does that trigger an investigation?
Well, what is alleged in the case Denise, is not only did they get together and decide that they wanted to raise the price of ebooks 30 or 40%, but part of the conspiracy was to force that model onto Amazon, so that Amazon would no longer be able to sell at a low price, because if they tried to do that, the various book publishers would deny them the books on the publishers' lists. So the whole notion was, and the whole notion of conspiracy, generally speaking, is we're going to try to avoid free market competition. We're going to try to get together and raise price to a point that we think is the right level, as opposed to letting companies duke it out in free and open competition.
I see. So even if Amazon had some agreements with publishers that required the publishers to provide ebooks at a certain price for a certain time, if those expired, everything would be fair game.
Yeah, what was going on in the industry basically is, in effect, a resale model that for hard books, the publishers were selling the books to resellers like Amazon, and then Amazon, under our resale price maintenance laws, had the right to place the retail price of the book at any level it wanted to, and it placed that price at $9.99, and that really worried the book publishers, because they were afraid nobody would ever pay more for that than that for a book, which is in fact what is likely to happen. And so they not only raised the price, they allegedly colluded with Apple to change the entire distribution model from a resale model to an agency model. And it's probably not worth going into all the detail here, but the net effect of that change allegedly was to raise the price level that consumers have to pay quite significantly, and to force that higher level on all distributors of books, including Amazon. That's the gravamen of the government's charge.
And Denise, it's if you read the Department of Justice case itself, or the action, what's interesting is, I think, and you've mentioned this in prior shows that I've listened to, the publishers had a great thing going, and they were really trying to protect their older business model. I don't know if we have exact pricing examples in the case, but the publishers were giving digital books to Amazon at, let's say $12.99 as their wholesale cost when they were under the wholesale model, and Amazon was taking a loss. A lot of cases, it's perfectly legal to sell things at a loss as a loss leader, and so Amazon was actually the publishers were actually making more in revenue than what Amazon was actually even able to sell it for. So, they're getting $12.99 per book, and Amazon is at $9.99, which happens all the time in consumer goods. There's hot price points where a 2-liter bottle of soda becomes a $99 price point, and it's very hard to move off of that price point because consumers expect it. So they're really trying to protect their hardcover industry. They were worried that if books became $9.99 because of this digital selling price, people wouldn't want to buy their hardcover books anymore at $25. They really, if they could have thought ahead and said, well, the future is going to be digital anyway. If Amazon wants to sell our books at a loss, great, go for it. We'll sell you our books at $25.99, and you take the full loss down to $9.99. Of course, eventually that would hurt their hardcover business, but I think that was going away anyway. So I think it's another example where they were trying to protect an existing business model instead of embracing what Amazon was doing and letting them take a loss on their sales. I mean, that's a beautiful position to be in if a company's willing to do that for you.
Evan, what do you think of all this?
I'm just, the question that I want to ask is the simple question of, isn't this action by the DOJ against these publishers just handing a check to Amazon to bolster its market dominance in the first place? There was an article that we read in our show notes for today that kind of pointed out the fact that Amazon is the bad guy here, but this Department of Justice action, from a certain perspective, seems to be against the public interest, in as much as just fortifying Amazon's position here. So I guess my inquiry would want to go into the validity of that point, because it seems to make sense at a certain level, but I'm also skeptical that the Department of Justice would do something quite that foolish. So I would want to get the reaction of somebody who could give some insight into that. And it wouldn't be me on this call.
Well, Gary, let me add a piece to that, because that's what Apple is asserting, right? That, hey, it's good that we came out with a competitive ebook distribution platform. We have wonderful tools that make, if you use the iBook Author, you can create a whole reading experience that's not right now available on any other platform. So it's good. We're innovating. We're good for competition. So what do you think? Is Apple going to skate on this?
I think that's Apple's PR position, and it clearly is having some impact PR-wise, but it's not a legal defense, or it would be very difficult to make a legal defense. As I said, generally speaking, although not always, if people get together, if manufacturers or publishers or makers of products get together and fix price, we deem it what's called per se illegal. In some respects, it's worse than murder, because if you kill somebody, we'll at least ask you why you did it, and we'll take that into account. But for the most part, in hardcore price fixing, you don't get to give a justification like that, because we've decided as a nation we're not interested in hearing it for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Because every industry would then become cartelized and raise prices. So when I looked at the article that was passed around in the show notes, from an antitrust perspective, really not, almost laughable, I would have to say. It's not the kind of thing. I think that Apple would struggle to even, for the judge even to allow that to go to the jury as a consideration. But of course, we'll see down the road. I don't want to prejudge that. But generally speaking, when you think about our antitrust laws, they are there to ensure the benefits of competition in terms of lower prices to consumers. That's the basic point. So if you're the book industry and you're concerned about Amazon, you don't fix price to stave off Amazon. You try in other ways to compete harder. Since the time that article was written, for example, Microsoft has now entered this market in combination with Barnes & Noble over the Nook. Google is still in the market for digital books. Apple, Amazon, as we've said. It looks like a competitive market, at least at the moment. And in any event, Amazon's market share would not justify price fixing.
And I had a question for Gary as well about that same question about monopolization. Isn't it true that if a de facto monopoly occurs because of the market, that in and of itself is not illegal? In other words, if Amazon takes the strategy that we're just going to sell every ebook at a maximum price of $9.99, even if a publisher charges us $30 initially, we're going to sell that same book at $9.99, and they wind up with a 90% market share because they have the best price, that in and of itself isn't illegal. The government steps in when people start raising prices based on a monopoly. I mean, to my knowledge, this is the first time I've ever heard of a situation where, a monopoly was beginning to form based on, the lowest price in the market. Obviously, they were doing that to sell Kindle readers, and also to get people in the Amazon ecosystem to buy other things. But, if Amazon had a 90% market share because of a great price, that in and of itself is not a problem. Is that correct?
Well, taking it out directly from the Amazon situation for a second, because I don't want to prejudge the evidence there. But generally speaking, what you say is absolutely correct. In other words, under our law, if you have a monopoly, that by itself is not illegal. What's illegal is what's called monopolization. Namely, you do some things to get the monopoly, or more often to maintain the monopoly in the face of competition. So, for example, back in the 90s and early 2000s, when the government went after Microsoft, they didn't go after Microsoft because Microsoft had a monopoly. They went after Microsoft because Microsoft was doing a number of things to keep Netscape from being able to get its browser to market. Microsoft was tying up the OEMs. Microsoft was interlocking its browser and its operating system code. Those bad acts are what made Microsoft have an enormous problem. And similarly, to flash forward to today, the government is investigating Google. They're not investigating Google because Google has some huge share in search. They're investigating Google because the charges are that Google used that power, that large share, and the market power that comes with that share to exclude vertical competitors, niche competitors like comparison shopping vertical engines, or travel vertical engines, that Google manipulated its search results in order to favor its own properties. Now that's different. Obviously, it's an additional factor from simply having a large market share. I certainly agree with the thrust of your question. In the Amazon case, Amazon would take the position that they, in fact, developed this market, that nobody was going to buy ebooks, and then by seeding the market through low price sales, they started getting everybody interested, and that's what generated the market. We'll see where that goes, but I don't expect it to be a huge part of a price fixing defense, although maybe I'll be wrong about that.
And to throw it back to you, Denise, I look at it from a business person, and I think if I have a retailer that's dominant in the industry and is willing to take a loss on my goods, regardless of what I sell it to them, that's an amazing situation to be in, that I can keep raising my prices on my ebooks if I was a publisher up to $15, $20, $25, and the consumer never has to see those prices, and Amazon just writes me bigger and bigger checks. They had an unbelievable good thing going if they thought about the long-term situation. And I think they were, again, they wanted to change it because they were worried of what it would do to their hardcover business model, and not realizing, I think, what a beautiful situation they really had in their hands.
Evan, have we lost Denise again?
Think so.
It seems to be the case.
There are always problems with an undisclosed location. So maybe we could change the discussion a little bit to one of the other antitrust matters on Silicon Valley's agenda, which is this lawsuit now that follows a government investigation. And the government investigation alleged that the big Silicon Valley companies had an agreement among themselves not to poach each other's key employees. In other words, we've been talking here about conspiracies involving oil and perhaps conspiracies involving books and ebooks. But here is the allegation involving what in Silicon Valley is the most important component of our company, of our main Silicon Valley companies, their employee talent. And the allegation that was brought by the government and settled by these big companies was that they called each other and they agreed that they wouldn't poach each other's key employees. And they did that one-on-one, but eventually became, in effect, a whole big conspiracy that retarded employees' ability to go from one company to another and get a better job and better benefits and so forth and so on. And the Department of Justice that originally brought the case had email between Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt, for example, that appeared to suggest that there was a conspiracy of this kind, or at least an agreement of this kind, at least under certain circumstances. Now, the person who was in charge of the Department of Justice Antitrust Division at that time was not a vigorous antitrust enforcer. And so what basically happened was that she allowed all these companies to simply settle without admitting liability. But then along comes the plaintiff's antitrust bar, and they bring lawsuits on behalf of the Silicon Valley employees as a class, saying that these employees have been damaged, that they should have made more money, that they should have had other benefits. The big companies have tried in court to get that case dismissed, and only a week ago, the judge denied that motion and said, no, this case is going to go to trial unless you shell out big bucks and settle it. So that's a very interesting example in Silicon Valley of how our anti-collusion laws are applied in modern times to modern issues.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty slam dunk case. That seems pretty tough to defend.
When I was reading about that, when I got to the part where they were discussing the damages that the plaintiffs are claiming here, or at least the theory for liability that would translate into damages on this, it was the money that they didn't make by being able to move from company to company here. And what came into my mind is, isn't that, from a certain perspective, a little bit ironic that, you know, the workers were alleging that they missed out on millions, but that means that the companies that would have paid them would have had to take that out of their revenues, and it would have affected their bottom line. And we all know that the companies then would have passed that cost of doing business onto the consumers. So we're in a strange situation here. And I realize there are other things. I don't even know if this was framed as an antitrust lawsuit, but, you know, certainly an anti-competition lawsuit, in both the civil action and the government actions here. I mean, aren't we in a strange position if what we're arguing is if the plaintiffs were given the relief requested, that would actually mean a higher price for goods and services to the consumer? That's what seems interesting in when I thought about that. So I'd be interested in see what your guys' reaction is on that perspective.
Well, so let's pursue that a little bit, Evan. So the basic notion is that companies are supposed to compete with each other. It is far more difficult to pass on higher costs in a market where there are a lot of entrants and they're all competing with each other than in a market in which there's collusion. So the general notion would be, yeah, you may have to pay more for your employees, but you're still going to have to compete against each other and so forth and so on. In other words, absent collusion or monopoly share, you just can't raise price infinitely. In some cases, it starts coming out of your profits. That's the way the competitive system works. I do think, though, that as you point out, the part of the plaintiff's case that is going to be most difficult to prove and most speculative is exactly how much are these employees entitled to. In other words, I think that from what I've seen, based on the allegations, there looks to be at least an interesting claim of liability, but then you get off into the issue of whether that's quantifiable in some way or in any way, and that becomes a difficult issue for trial that I'm sure we'll be hearing more about. The case isn't scheduled for trial for a couple of years yet.
Gary, are those anti-collusion laws for employment, are they primarily state-based? In other words, is there a federal anti-collusion law? I thought it was interesting that all the companies named were based in California, so I wasn't sure if that was a California-specific situation, or is there a state, in fact, where that would be legal to collude if a state law allowed it? I'm not aware of any, but I was just curious if that would be possible.
No, as Evans... I don't know whether there's state employment law that would be affected, but this was brought as a Sherman Act case, in effect. It was brought the same way that a case involving collusion over books would be brought, or a collusion over oil, or any kind of collusion. It just so happened that the input here was employee talent. It is true, of course, as you point out, that all the companies are California companies, but what gives federal jurisdiction is that all these companies operate over state lines. I mean, they're all big companies. They have operations all around the world and certainly in many, many states. And so that solves the federal nexus sufficiently so that it can be brought as a federal case.
I want to get into more about Google because the employee situation isn't the only antitrust issue that it's facing right now. But before I do that, I want to take a quick break and thank our sponsor for this episode of This Week in Law, which is ShareFile. Now, let's face it, you guys, probably everyone on the show today, probably lots of people listening have figured out that they need some good solution for getting big files to their business associates in a secure way. And probably the default way to do it is to find a consumer-oriented product like Dropbox to sort of, fill this gap that you have in your business life. But there's no need to do that anymore because ShareFile is here and it's wonderful. It's going to provide you with a secure, professional way to address this problem. Whether when you're a lawyer, you have briefs with tons of exhibits, you have document productions, you have huge agreements with lots of exhibits as well that need to be gotten securely to and from the people you're working with. And often your clients are in the same conundrum. They have things that they need to get to you and they don't have a good solution to do it. But ShareFile is going to be that for you. You can send confidential files, whether or not you're in or out of the office, because you can send files of almost any size and you can access ShareFile from any computer or mobile device. It enhances your workflow easily and securely. So here's my suggestion. If you are limping along with one of these consumer-oriented solutions to your file sharing program, go ahead and start using ShareFile. And guess what? If your organization isn't already using it, once they see what a great product it is, you may well be able to get that in the door. And I'm going to make it even easier for you to try and do that. We're going to give you a 30-day free trial plus double storage. You have to try this out today. Visit sharefile.com, click on the radio microphone that you see there, and enter the promo code TWiL, TWiL. Remember, visit sharefile.com and type in TWiL, and we're going to solve this problem for you once and for all. Thanks so much, ShareFile, for your support of This Week in Law. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about Google. Because the employee case is not its only antitrust concern. Gary, you want to bring us up to speed there?
Yeah, Google really has a lot of problems vis-a-vis the government these days, and it's not just the government of the United States. Part of Google's problems involve antitrust or competition policy. Google is being investigated by the Federal Trade Commission. It's being investigated by the European Commission, which is the administrative arm of the European Union, the government of Europe. It's being investigated, I believe, by Argentina. It's being investigated by Korea, all for alleged antitrust violations, or at least antitrust issues. These issues come in two forms, basically. Some go to conduct that Google allegedly may have undertaken to make it difficult for its so-called horizontal competitors in search. These are companies like Microsoft Bing, to make it difficult for those companies to get a toehold in the search market. The part of the case that I'm more interested in and more directly involved in is the part in which Google is alleged to manipulate its search results to make it difficult for these specialty search engines to be able to get to customers. Sometimes, allegedly, Google preferences its own properties. Sometimes, allegedly, Google penalizes these other companies, taking them out of top search results, sometimes off the front page, sometimes out of the search results entirely. So those allegations and allegations involving Google's use of the Android platform to further its search monopoly, those kinds of things are under current investigation. At the same time, Google is being investigated for privacy issues, and we've seen just in recent weeks this Y-Spy scandal. I guess I could use that term because I don't think anybody thinks it's a good set of circumstances. But this Y-Spy scandal has raised its head again. I've read that the Europeans are now reopening investigations. There are calls for Senate hearings, for renewed investigation by the administrative groups in our government. And so Google would appear to have a lot of problems, but if you could easily put them, I think, into two big camps. One involves antitrust violations. The other involves privacy concerns.
Got it. Do you think, Gary, that Google, as it gets bigger and bigger and is more than just a search company, do you think that it might start facing the same kinds of problems that Microsoft faced in connection with Explorer and Netflix? Namely, that it is favoring its own products and maybe bundling them or tying them together in various ways that might make them in even more antitrust hot water.
The short answer is yes. I mean, some of these legal words have particular terminology attached to some of these legal terms, like bundling and tying, and I don't know that it's worth going into the detail around them. But the answer to the thrust of your question is certainly yes. It looks to me and to many other people very much like the Microsoft case, almost exactly like the Microsoft case, in the sense that there's some minor differences. I mean, Microsoft generally used OEMs and intermediaries and distributors to enforce its policy of exclusion, and Google does that directly because it doesn't have OEMs in its distribution channel, and so it's able to exclude directly without putting the heat on third parties. But generally speaking, the thrust of the case would be the same, and you may recall back in the 90s when the Department of Justice got real serious about the Microsoft case. They brought in a very celebrated, excellent antitrust litigator named David Boies, who eventually tried the case against Microsoft and won that case. Well, just in the last couple of weeks, the Federal Trade Commission has announced that it's bringing in a very seasoned litigator of comparable stature, a woman named Beth Wilkinson, who came up and earned her stripes as a government prosecutor. She got the death penalty against the Oklahoma City bomber. She has defended big pharmaceutical companies in jury trials and won those cases. So on paper, at least, she's quite a formidable adversary, and the Federal Trade Commission has announced that they are hiring her to help them make the decision about whether to bring the case, and then if it's brought, to be the lead counsel in the litigation. This is an enormously important event. It's an enormously important event in trying to evaluate how the government looks at Google and how serious the government is about Google's conduct. There's also one aspect of it that's not as well understood, but is certainly just as significant. The Federal Trade Commission has two basic ways it can go after companies. It can bring an administrative action within the Federal Trade Commission, or alternatively, it can file a lawsuit in federal court, just like the Department of Justice did against Microsoft. Now, up until recently, it was thought that maybe the Federal Trade Commission didn't have as many lawyers who were experienced in high-stakes litigation in federal district courts, and so they would be more likely to bring an administrative proceeding, which might not result in much in the way of penalties. But by bringing this woman aboard, they make it clear that they now have the capability to bring a serious case like the Microsoft case, and so that, in addition, makes this development quite significant.
Gary, you were talking with me before the show about Google's privacy policy and about privacy in general being implicated by strong antitrust enforcement. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, this is one of the interesting questions. We started this discussion here today talking about how antitrust would implicate the distribution of product and so forth. One of the big issues in the technology community right now and among users is privacy. And particularly as a result of this Y-Spy issue coming back to the fore, there are going to be questions about how well privacy is protected and whether there needs to be additional legislation by Congress to make it clear that users have certain privacy rights and make it clear that companies have to respect those rights. Now, as I went around Capitol Hill talking to the staffs of senators about Google's antitrust, what from my perspective are at least allegedly violations, but antitrust considerations, the issue of privacy would always come up as well because, part of the reason we have a privacy issue vis-a-vis Google is the fact that it dominates so much of the market. I mean, it's combining all of the data it has on you, but if it only had 30% share in these various markets, then it really wouldn't make that much difference, or at least not as much difference as a company that has a far larger share and that you use all the time for all different kinds of search and then for Gmail and for other things. When a company that dominant combines all the information on you, they can develop quite a dossier. So among conservatives in particular, conservative legislators would inevitably ask the question, well, you know, I am concerned about this privacy issue, but I don't want there to be a Federal Bureau of Privacy Protection. In my view, we got too many federal bureaus. Could we, in fact, get better privacy protection if we enforce the antitrust laws more vigorously? In other words, if we were enforcing the antitrust laws against Google, would that in some way make them more susceptible to consumer concerns about privacy? That's become a significant issue that's kicking around in antitrust circles now, because on one hand, you have privacy advocates, and I'm sure you've discussed this on the show from time to time, whose views I respect, and they say, look, you know, more competition won't make any difference because all of these companies have the same business model. They conduct surveillance on their own users. And so, you know, if they compete with each other, what difference will it make? Well, you know, I don't think that's entirely true. Within the web eco structure, there are several business models going on. There's certainly the Google model, which I suppose one could characterize as surveillance on its own users. But then you have the Apple model, which is an older model, in effect saying we're going to sell you goods, and that's how we're going to make our money. And then you have Microsoft somewhere in between, which is largely based on the sale of goods, but it has Bing, and Bing is based on advertising, at least to some extent. But in any event, you have I think I'm back. That was just the light going out. But in any event, you have competing models. And so if there were antitrust enforcement that prevented Google's alleged monopolistic conduct and exclusionary conduct, maybe some of these other models would get even greater traction, and consumers would view them in even higher regard because they wouldn't have to sacrifice their privacy in order to get the use of good products. That all depends, however, on one important point, which we could characterize as transparency. In other words, for there to be any kind of effective privacy policy, consumers need to know when their privacy has been breached. And Google has done an excellent job over the last several years of obscuring that, of settling these matters before the truth was completely out. And of course, if the truth's not out there, then consumers have no way to evaluate whether one distribution model is better for them than another. And so one of the interesting things about this, the latest iteration of this Y-Spy situation, is that more information is coming out. And once consumers understand how their data is being used by a company, they're better able to make a determination about whether they want to do business with that company. And so that's how the two things, privacy on one hand and antitrust on the other hand, might intersect in the future. Now, of course, it may end up that we'll just have to have legislation or greater enforcement. Right now, the Federal Trade Commission is taking the position that it is relying for the most part on voluntary enforcement, voluntary cooperation by companies. I don't think that's working very well. I don't think most people think it's working particularly well. The Federal Trade Commission will go after companies when they say they have one privacy policy and in fact they have a different privacy policy, and that's how Google got into trouble over Buzz. And it looks like Google may get into trouble again over its alleged hacking of Safari, Apple's browser, because allegedly Google was saying to users that the browser would keep them secure and safe under certain circumstances, and allegedly at the same time hacking around that browser so it didn't have that effect. But at the end of the day, it may end up that we're going to have to directly address the issue of whether the privacy policies are sufficient and not simply whether they are being implemented as stated.
All right. Well, our in-house libertarian, Stefan Kinsella, I think would beg to differ whether antitrust is the appropriate vehicle to indirectly go after privacy. When we were talking, I posted up before the show some of our topics, and antitrust, of course, was big on this week's list. Stefan came along and mentioned that, in his opinion, the feds are the biggest monopolists of all and price fixers. And then he said beam mode I, which I had to look at, not being terribly biblical in my own background. But Evan, do you think Stefan's right that if we're that we've already got, big government adversaries in droves having a vocal say right now, and that perhaps antitrust is not the way to do this?
Well, I certainly respect Stefan's perspective on things, and he's inarguably pretty radical in his abolitionist sort of views. He's big on the abolition of all intellectual property law, and it sounds like he would be very much in that frame of mind talking about antitrust law and letting pure market forces put their self in play here and let things sort them out pursuant to that. It's got to be somewhere in the middle, I think. And the trouble would be with too much power in the federal government. That's what gives some credence to Stefan's perspective, is saying the federal government are the biggest monopolists of all, and the problems with that go there. I just see something that's fundamentally strange when we start talking about the interplay between privacy and antitrust concerns in the environment where Google is operating, in as much as its objective is to take just unfathomably large amounts of information about what's on the web and the information about its users, and to put some kind of order onto that and serve that up as a product and as a useful commodity, if you will, in the marketplace. Gary, just to pick up on something that you said, there were at least, I think I counted 17, but there were probably 20 some really important issues that you raised in what you were saying a while ago. We're concerned about Google's market share and about how much information it has about people, and it knows everything about everyone. But the problem is that it has a disproportionate amount of the market share. So one solution to that might be to have other entities, competitors to Google, who also have a bunch of information about people. But doesn't that seem to be antithetical to some of the concerns that underlie the issue of privacy? One of them being, well, we don't want a bunch of information about ourselves individually out there at risk of being disclosed to the world at large. Am I mischaracterizing the issue? And if so, what would be the appropriate way of thinking about this if we were to have, 3 or 4 Googles out there with a bunch of information about everybody? Doesn't that really make privacy a huge concern that really it presents a fundamental, obstruction to the resolution of that issue of how we deal with privacy in the information economy?
Yeah, so those are certainly good questions, and I don't know that there is an antitrust solution to the privacy conundrum. But I do want to clarify here. Obviously, if you had 5 Googles, you'd have 5 times the problem that you have now. On the other hand, if you were doing searches on 4 different or 5 different sites, then any one site wouldn't have the same amount of information on you that Google has now. And similarly, Google's not just taking the information on search, but recently they've announced that they're taking all the information that they have on you. And I know that there are many people in the world who use Gmail. I won't do that. I just won't. I mean, in many cases, except for Denise, I won't even respond to email that's sent to me on Gmail. So So, that's a so anyway, I do want to, though, move over to the first part of what you raised. I don't know Stefan personally, but these concerns about using antitrust emanate from libertarians and from Tea Party people, actually, in Congress. This is a concern of theirs, and I want to say that I suppose there are a few people like Stefan, I don't know him, as I said, who want to abolish antitrust laws. But in this Google situation, what you find, there were just these hearings in the Senate, and there was everybody from Al Franken on the left to Mike Lee, the conservative senator from Utah on the right, all concerned about Google and Google's market power. So I think there's a broad consensus, at least on the antitrust side, that something needs to be done here. And after those hearings, the ranking Democrat, the chairman of the antitrust subcommittee, Herb Kohl of Wisconsin, joined Mike Lee, the conservative Republican of Utah, in sending a letter to John Leibowitz, the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, urging him to move ahead with the serious investigation of Google. So I with all due respect to Stefan, I think that's very much an outlying view at this stage. I mean, I think there's consensus that we have a problem. Now, as Evan says, can that problem be completely remedied by antitrust? Perhaps not. Could it be ameliorated by better antitrust enforcement, as some of these Tea Party people have suggested to me? Perhaps, but only in a situation of vigorous antitrust enforcement and complete transparency. When scandals like Wi-Fi occur, people need to understand how their data has been used.
Gary, a question on that point you made, though. Earlier in the show, we had established that a monopoly in of itself is not a problem unless it shows there's some harm to consumers. To my knowledge, there's no federal law that says there's an absolute right to privacy online. It's my understanding that most of these cases are brought against companies because they say we're going to do X and then they really do Y, or they say we're not going to use your data for X, Y, and Z purposes, but then it turns out that they really were and they weren't very upfront about it. If Google just came out and said, look, everything you give us, we can use however we wish. We're going to take all of your private information. We're going to read every letter of your email, and we're going to sell it to marketers. And they just were very, very upfront about it. Now, of course, their market share might go down if they were that direct. But if they were very upfront and said, everything you type in Google, we're going to use for marketing purposes and expose publicly, and they still had a monopoly, so to speak, on search, is that in and of itself a problem in terms of they're not necessarily violating any laws, to my understanding, and that's why I'm asking you the question, if there's an inherent privacy law on the books in the federal government. I don't think there is there?
Not that I'm aware of in the way you've described. I mean, in other words, I think you're describing a realistic concern, which is that maybe they could pass muster under the current regulatory structure simply by disclosing everything. And that's the reason many privacy experts think that we need additional legislation, because that wouldn't be good enough. What I'm suggesting here is what you've intimated and what you just said, which is make them disclose everything. Because as you suggest, I think that if everything were disclosed, as you suggest, their market share might well go down, because people like all of us who are participating in this discussion and millions more would start to wonder whether we're doing something that's net helpful to ourselves over the long run. So what I'm suggesting is before we go through this tortuous path of new legislation, let's at least try and see whether it makes a difference if we have effective antitrust enforcement and transparency, and again, in the way you described.
Yeah, and I think from a business perspective, I think it would be interesting to see what would happen. I think there's a huge generational difference between what we view as private versus like what my kids, even in high school, view as private. And obviously they haven't been around as long to realize that some of these things will last forever, and they have to be careful about that. But It is curious. I think we both all assumed that their market share would go down if they were fully disclosed like that. I don't know. What would happen if they decided to share some of the advertising revenue directly to their user base? In other words, we're going to disclose everything to the world on what you do, and in return of that, we'll give you 10% or whatever we make on advertising based on your data. We'll give it directly to you in the form of some kind of PayPal credit or something like that. I'm just curious. Over the long term, I wonder if privacy will be something that will be viewed as a negative. In other words, if you violate my privacy, there's an inherent belief that that's bad. I wonder in 30 years if that will even be viewed the same way anymore.
Well, Todd, I think sorry, let me jump in for a second. Todd, I think you hit on a couple of interesting things there. One, I think it's probably wrong to think that Google isn't disclosing what it's doing with people's data, especially as of its March revision to its privacy policy. It's got some pretty broad latitude to do what it needs to do. Now, you can question whether that's a good thing or not, and you can also take into account that it's got to comply with different privacy standards internationally. Of course, the EU being very stringent about what it needs to do. Secondly, the point you just raised, having some sort of economic relationship with users about data is an intriguing idea that's been out there for a while. Steve Gilmore founded something called the Attention Trust a few years ago that was looking squarely at that kind of issue. And as far as I know, nothing concrete has played out there, but it's interesting that you raise it again, and I think it's not unrealistic to think that we'll be headed in that direction. I don't know if Google will be the trailblazer, but somebody will make some kind of economic pact with users.
Can I make a comment about your comment for a second, Denise?
Sure.
On the issue of Google compliance, I don't know. We could debate about whether the combining is compliant with what they said before. I mean, some people think it is. Some people think it's not. The Wi-Fi thing, though, is very, very different. I mean, what's come out as a result of this report is that, engineers with the knowledge of their superior, or at least an engineer with the knowledge of his superiors, went around willfully acquiring everything he could get out of your private Wi-Fi connection in your home and used it for whatever purpose he wished. And that's pretty jarring. And I don't think that was the kind of thing that consumers contemplated in their calculus, that there could be a car going down the street that would literally spy on their internal connections. And when we think, I certainly am mindful of the point that Todd made that the younger generations, yet certainly younger than me, may not care about privacy as much. But I would make 2 points. One is the websites now and even the newspapers in Silicon Valley are filled with stories of employers checking, asking for Twitter passwords and Facebook passwords, and how younger people are now shocked and appalled that employers would try to do this. Well, of course, employer has and can get only a fraction of the information that Google has. And if Google wanted to sell that information to employers, I don't know how many people could get jobs in the future. Because, second point, I think that we all tell our search engines very confidential things about ourselves, more confidential than we put into emails. As various people have pointed out, you tell your search engine things you wouldn't even tell your spouse. And so there's a level there. It's even very different from what you put out on Facebook, which you're willing to tell your friends. But, think about the stuff you search for and how, and many people use anonymous searching techniques now, which, I think are great ideas. But in any event, I think there's more there that's coming. I think that this issue is not going to go away. It doesn't look like Y-Spy is going to go away. Now that the engineer's been identified and the call for congressional hearings, I think we're going to hear a lot more about that.
Hey folks, the lights are back on here in the TWiL studio, and I'm coming in to tell you a little about Squarespace, which of course is the fast and easy way to create a high quality website or blog. I've used it for years. It's a wonderful way to maintain your website. Its UI for creating and managing your site is seamless. It just works. It gets out of your way, which is exactly what you want a UI to do. They've recently started giving out free domains to all annual plan customers so that you never have to pay for a domain or worry about hosting it. It's all conveniently integrated when you sign up and requires zero configuration by making domain selection and mapping completely seamless. And even if you decide to cancel the service, the domain is yours to keep. It's also simplified its subscription plans and provided reduced pricing, now offering standard plans starting as low as $8 a month. Squarespace is optimized for both beginners and CSS experts, and of course, everybody in between. It features a developer-friendly CSS editor that allows you to pop out the entire window in full screen, colorize, code, undo, find, and replace everything you'd want to do with your CSS, of course. Hundreds of design templates to choose from, and you can customize any of the designs to fit your needs. It has iPhone, iPad, and Android apps, so you can update your site or blog wherever you are on the go. Google's complete web font library is now part of Squarespace. It has over 300 fonts now fully integrated. It has online resources and a special support team to give you personal help 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I've used this a lot because I wind up having questions on something I want to tweak or add to the site. And I can tell you they get back to you right away. And it's very personalized. You're talking to an individual who follows up and makes sure that your problem is completely solved. These all-inclusive services include several modules to build your website. The blog module supports movable type, typepad, WordPress. There's a form builder to collect email addresses and other information from your visitors, a Flickr photo display, a Twitter widget, social media buttons to connect your website visitors to your networks on Facebook and Twitter. There's Google Maps and more. Website tracking so you know how many times your site is viewed, and a built-in search engine optimizer to make sure that you're showing up right where you should be in search results, permission access handling, and cloud architecture for speed and site stability. So use Squarespace for all your website needs. Build it, host it, and update it anytime. To do this, you don't need to sign up for any kind of paid account. You don't need a credit card. Sign up for a free account and start building out your site. Then if you decide to purchase it, use offer code TWiL5 and you'll get 10% off your first purchase for every new account, no matter what. And don't forget about free domain registration with those annual plan subscriptions. That's squarespace.com and use the offer code TWiL5. Thank you so much, Squarespace, for your support of This Week in Law.
So our tip of the week is going to be kind of in time about avoiding antitrust issues. And basically the takeaway from that is if you're not arrogant as a company, then you should be fine. I think we can probably go into a little bit more detail than that. Todd, when we look at Google, they have this great data liberation front that they've done that helps people, it's the opposite of lock-in, right? It helps people get their data out of Google. Do you have any other suggestions for Google or any?
Well, I think Google might have the...
Good. All right, go ahead.
Sorry about that. You cut off there for a second. I thought you were done. I think Google might have what's known as the innovator's dilemma in the sense that they've already built such a huge search engine and business and their accompanying businesses that it might be tough for them to turn 180 degrees. But I really think that it might not be everybody out there. But if you gave them economic advantages or services that they thought they couldn't live without, I think there's going to be a really large group of consumers out there that really don't mind disclosing a lot about their personal lives in order to get economic benefits from it. I think if Google, the Wi-Fi, Spygate, and everything else, when you start lying both in what your actions were and what your intentions were, that's when you get into trouble. It's a classic situation where the initial crime is not prosecuted. It's the lying when the investigation happens that gets the people in trouble. So I think if Google was just very upfront in what they were doing, that's going to solve 95% of what the issue is. Because once again, we've already established that a monopoly in and of itself is not bad, or it's not illegal, and there is no inherent privacy law on the books if they disclose it properly, what they're going to use with their data. The question, of course, is going to be, do people still keep using their services or not? And before I'm accused of defending Google, I actually use a search engine called DuckDuckGo specifically because it doesn't track anything that you type in your search engine. So I'm not really here to defend Google as someone that uses it all the time. But I think there's a lot of business models out there actually of trying to tap into personal shopping habits and I guess, search engine equivalents. Coming from a consumer products world, if you absolutely know for certain that a consumer is buying a certain product and you have that with definite certainty, in other words, you're not just relying on search engines, but you know that person has actually bought and purchased that item, for example, the shopper cards that you find in grocery stores, that's incredibly valuable information to have and to market against. And I think the issue is that if you can actually give consumers the right motivation to share that information, I think everybody's happy then. The consumers get an economic value from that. In a lot of cases, it's worth it actually just to give them free product that, because they might become a lifelong user of your product, it's actually worth it just to give them a full-size box of detergent or whatever it is, if you know enough of their shopping habits. So if the consumers know that their data is being shared and they can get a direct economic benefit from that, I think everybody's happy. One of the reasons why I think Google is in its problems, or at least it has this icky feeling, for lack of a better word, with consumers and lawmakers, is that they're sharing all this personal information and they're capturing all of the advertising benefit from it. They can argue that the consumer benefits because they have a great search engine experience, or YouTube is better than Vimeo, which I think are all kind of weak arguments. Right now, it just feels that consumers are getting quote unquote exploited from Google because they're getting all the economic benefit, and the same can be said as Facebook as well. I think if a Facebook or a Google type competitor came out there and actually shared in the revenue with consumers, that would be maybe the next big thing to rock Silicon Valley.
Okay, Gary, do you have any thoughts for tech companies and along the antitrust front, what they can do to avoid issues?
I think that companies frequently get into trouble on the well, let's look at the cases that we've discussed here today. We have discussed some conspiracy cases, and we've discussed some monopolization investigations, which may turn into cases. On the conspiracy side, most established companies, like say Procter & Gamble, have antitrust compliance programs within their company. And if you actually went to a meeting with a competitor and discussed price with no lawyer present under the policies of those companies, that would be a firing offense. So it's not clear. It's not clear whether some of these Silicon Valley companies are as mature in that respect as some of the older companies in more established industries are. But it's pretty easy to avoid conspiracy problems. You just got to have a lawyer tell you what you can do and can't do. Whoops, excuse me.
The dark side.
Yeah. I can't get it to come back on this time. Oh, there we go. Okay.
My power problems are becoming your power problems.
That's right. You're infecting me. But in any event, it's no great shakes to figure out how to avoid a conspiracy issue, because these big Eastern companies do it all the time, and they know how to do it, and it's established. On the monopolization side, in my experience, companies run into problems after they've achieved a monopoly, and when they're trying to protect that monopoly from new innovation or new competition or new market entry. And that's a very sensitive time, because from an antitrust perspective, we got to have new market entry and we got to have new innovation. And so if you're an entrenched company trying to beat off some innovator, we're going to scrutinize what you're doing pretty darn closely. And that's where Microsoft got into trouble when it was challenged by this new browser technology. That's where Google seems to be getting into trouble, because it's challenged by these these specialty search engines that are quite extensible throughout commercial search and could cut the guts out of Google's monopoly in a monetization sense. So when you're taking actions against a competitor and you're an entrenched company, you better be very, very careful. And from what we can see of at least what's become public so far of what Google has done, they haven't been that careful. You know, in the Y-Spy situation, notes were released that said that this engineer was supposed to check off with a lawyer, but he never did. And it's not clear how much of what is alleged about Google has been cleared by lawyers and on what theory, and how much is being defended after the fact. But it is very clear where the antitrust sensitivity is, and if you're focused there, you're going to avoid these problems. And these are only problems that occur to a few companies. I mean, I'm sure, you know, Todd would love to have a monopoly and have to worry about that stuff. But generally speaking, it's only a problem for a few companies, and they need to act very carefully.
Yeah, you raise a really good point, Gary, although I don't know if I buy into the fact that even the Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies do this very well either, because I've certainly represented plenty of those folks and been surprised at what decisions were made at a management level that really were questionable when it came down to, you know, legal or other regulatory kinds of consequences. Evan, do you think that there's a way? I mean, nobody wants more lawyers in their business, right? We just slow things down. How do you streamline this without getting people into trouble?
Well, that's a good question, and it underscores one of the problems, I think, with the Y-Spy situation here. It seemed very much hardwired into the ethos, and it is hardwired into the ethos of the Google engineering teams to, you know, be innovative and not let oneself be stifled in that process by legal concerns and, you know, going and talking to the lawyers who are inevitably going to slow things down. So I'm just thinking out loud here. I think it has to be kind of a mind shift at a certain way, both on the part of those who are doing the innovating, the engineers themselves, and also those who provide counsel to them. But, you know, I mean, there's no such thing as simple advice when it comes to antitrust questions like that. So I think like so many things that we talk about, it doesn't lend itself to a simple resolution, but it is something that is unique to the culture and unique to the circumstances that we find ourselves in with the rapidly accelerating pace of innovation in all forms of information technology. So to answer your question, Denise, I haven't the faintest idea.
All right, so maybe avoid arrogance isn't as bad advice as we thought.
Well, you know, I kind of take a little bit of issue with that because, you know, I mean, what do we mean by arrogance here? You know, it suggests a character flaw, you know, something that's particularly sinister to Google, and I think well, let me make one point clear. I'm just a simple country lawyer practicing at a trading post on the shores of one of the Great Lakes. So, you know, I'm not trying to be erudite in any kind of antitrust analysis or, you know, great market analysis here. It seems like, you know, with what Google is doing and what Google does is going to be something that's an inevitable attitude that large entities will take, and these are the kind of issues that they'll face, you know, anytime when they have widespread market success. You know, Google is obviously renegade when it deals with a lot of things, you know, taking over Yelp, you know, scraping Yelp results, for example, and then putting the pressure on Yelp saying, well, we'll just take you out of the index if you don't let us infringe your copyright, essentially, I think is what was going on last year, a couple of years ago. And so, and with the the Y-Spy situation, I mean, I think that's kind of a bad example to really use to indict Google on its privacy implications, because we got to remember even though the district court there's some private litigation, class action litigation going on over that, and I think the district court judge didn't make a right decision when he found that there could have been an a violation of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. So in my mind, it's unsettled whether Google actually did anything wrong in the first instance to breach anybody's privacy. And, clearly, as you pointed out, Todd, they probably should have been more, forthcoming about it in the first place. But, just to circle back to, I know you were actually trying to wrap up this point, Denise, and I kind of picked up on this question of arrogance here at the 11th hour. I just have a real problem with overgeneralizing an attitude to a large enterprise like that. It doesn't seem, perfectly helpful, and it's much more nuanced.
Yep, I agree. You're right to point that out, and I also like the fact that you pointed out it's important for people to both be aware of the issues that can arise from seemingly innocuous decisions, and for the lawyers in a company to realize that things need to proceed apace and business needs to go on, but maybe there's a way to more tightly integrate them with what's going on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis. And that's how folks can try and avoid snafus like what Apple is finding itself in the middle of right now. And speaking of that, we do have some resources of the week for you that are all related to not letting ebook marketplaces dictate your own book price. If you are a writer or publisher of any kind and you think that Amazon and Apple are both exerting too much control over what the price of your work should be, it's super interesting what people are doing with Kickstarter. I'll point out one example. Wainwright for the People is a young adult legal thriller that is getting funded, hoping to get funded on Kickstarter. And it's a great idea by a lawyer and a novelist who are putting this together jointly. And they want to raise $40,000. And they're looking to a Kickstarter model to be able to do that and put out their book. And they have a great educational spin to this and some companion materials for teachers and such that I think may well get them to their goal. There is also a website out there called Unbound that is a Kickstarter just for books. So if you want to put a book out and avoid the publishing model entirely and find an audience of people who have come to a place looking for books specifically to back, you should check out unbound.co.uk because that's what it seeks to be. And we'll put a couple of other things in our show notes at delicious.com/thisweekinlaw/160 that are resources for authors looking to crowdsource their works or crowdfund their works. So thanks so much, you guys. This has been a really sort of high-level discussion of some important issues. Gary, it's been so fun to have you back on the show. I'm glad we didn't wait all of 3 years to get you back. You were on in September 2009, so at least every 2.5 years we'll have to have you back on. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it was great fun, Denise.
Also, Todd, really appreciate you getting in touch and helping us go deep on these antitrust issues.
Great. I really appreciate you letting me be on the show. It was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. And Evan, loved chatting with you, my junior partner, as I will ever now think of you.
Well, thank you.
And thanks so much for all of your great insights today.
Well, you're welcome, and I hope that you'll be joining me this weekend in putting Paul's Boutique and License to Ill in heavy rotation after the untimely death of Adam Yauch, a.k.a. MCA, clearly a figure looming large in generation, on folks on either side of Generation X.
That's true. I might have thought that you would be too young to fully appreciate the beasties. But
oh, there you go. Now you're just picking on me. Yeah, right.
Yes, it's a very sad and tragic passing. So when you're not listening to TWiL every Friday at 11 o'clock Pacific, 1800 UTC, you can find us in various other places. You can find us on YouTube at twit.tv/TWiL. we're happy to join you whenever you have the time to listen to the show. So find us on iTunes or wherever you like to pick up your already post-production netcast listening and viewing materials. Also, come over to Google+. We've got a page there. I am frequently posting stuff about our upcoming show during the week before. I do that on Facebook as well, facebook.com/thisweekinlaw. It's how we do a lot of the prep for the show. So we really appreciate your help with that and your feedback as to what you want to hear about that week. Also, you can always give me a shout. I'm Denise at twit.tv. Love hearing from you in email. And we'll go ahead and dedicate this week's episode of This Week in Law in honor of May the 4th to loose grips and a certain awkwardness with protocol in honor of one of everybody's favorite all-time films. And with that, we'll see you next week on This Week in Law.